Please welcome our next moderator, Dr. Pete Gibbons, Director of Business Development for Europe at LabStat International. Pete brings deep scientific expertise to today's discussion. With a background in analytical chemistry, aerosol science, and next-generation nicotine products, he has played a key role in shaping industry standards through his contributions to European CEN, international FISO, committees, and CORESTA. With experience spanning both independent end companies and major analytical labs, Dr. Gibbons is uniquely positioned to guide our panel on the European and US pouch market. Dr. Gibbons, take it away.
Thank you very much, Will, for the kind introduction, and also to the ladies, thank you very much for the invitation to host such an esteemed panel for our discussion on European and US nicotine pouch market. Quite a broad discussion topic, so we'll pick out some areas that I think our panel can have their deep expertise, and I hope that we have a fruitful discussion. Just to introduce my fellow panelists, we have Fredrik Laurell, who is the CEO of Nicotino. Yes. Okay. And next to me we have Sarah Marking. She is the co-founder and chief strategic officer of Sonova. We also have Samuel Hampsher-Monk. He is the vice president of global regulatory strategy and business operations at the Applied Research Analysis Company. I visited their stand myself today. We also have Bengt Wiberg. Bengt is the president and founder of Sting-Free AB and a frequent contributor to these industry event discussions. And finally, we have Jonas Lundqvist. He is the CEO and founder of the Nordic Nicotine Pouch Alliance. So again, I'm honoured to be able to have this discussion with such an esteemed panel. So, as we know, we are here to discuss European and nicotine US pouch market. So the areas that I would like to discuss with the panel would include the current regulatory landscape, and I think it feeds well into Tim's discussion on the situation in Europe, potential bans, and a significant year certainly for the nicotine pouch industry. So we have our US experts and we have our European contingent as well on the panel, so that will be excellent. We're also going to talk a little bit about product safety and innovation. Again, the best practices and tools available to industry, and also, I think as Tim alluded to, what lessons can be learned from the vaping industry and youth access prevention. I think critical areas of discussion that the pouch industry needs to learn from. And potentially, we can also talk about some economic impacts of regulatory pathways. So to start off, we will discuss the regulatory landscape. As I mentioned, we have Sarah and we also have Sam, who are our experts. And I'm sure many of the people in the room are aware of the US FDA CTP overview of nicotine pouch products and the recent authorization of flavored ZYN nicotine pouches. So there have been substantial changes to the administration within the US with the Trump administration coming in, and changes at FDA CTP. So I'd like to go to Sarah just to give us an overview of what we've learned from ZYN, and then also with those changes at CTP, is that potentially going to be a good effect for more products being available to nicotine consumers, or is it going to be a case of we'll just have to wait and see?
Thank you, Pete. Very excited to be here and chat with all of you. I think what we've learned from the ZYN authorization, and for those who may not be familiar, FDA actually releases a document that details some of their thinking in terms of why they've made the authorization decisions that they have. And I think what we've seen from that is a sensible approach to flavors in pouches, which is a relief, I think, for many in this room, and I think the right choice moving forward for smokers who are using these products to transition. In addition to that, we saw the importance of monitoring youth usage associated with nicotine pouches. If you look at the timeline, the length of time it took FDA to authorize ZYN, it was quite a long time. It was in excess of 5 years. My opinion is that the agency was watching the youth use numbers as the rate of use of ZYN in the general population increased. And what we were able to show through monitoring of nationally representative surveys that track youth usage is that youth use did not increase at the same rate that we saw smokers picking up these products. And so the balance, particularly that FDA is considering, is the benefit to smokers and the risk to youth. And so that risk to youth component of the discussion was incredibly important in FDA's decision making. In terms of the substantial change in FDA leadership, I think we have an opportunity to see changes in the way FDA approaches these applications to increase the pace of review, which I think is one of the biggest issues that we face today. And so under new leadership, I think we'll have the opportunity for reform and sensible discussion with the agency to find a path that's more suitable for industry and for well-stewarded products to come onto the market.
Yeah, I think that's a perfect overview, Sarah. Sam, do you have any comments to add?
Sure. So the problem with following Sarah is excellent. Is trying to find something to contribute. No, I think that's exactly right. I mean, I look at the TBL for ZYN and think, it's both encouraging to the industry, but it's also instructive. So both with flavors, but also the approval of the full range of nicotine strength products. I think that's a relief, especially considering some of the perceptions around how the agency views nicotine or flavors in other kind of subcategories of products. But in terms of the bridging strategy that's evident in the TBL, that's also really helpful for other applicants as well. Dr. McCary's talked about bringing back the gold standard of evidence and bringing back logic to the decision-making process. And I think this is a logical TBL. You can see, reasoning and sense. So specifically with ZYN, we specialize in modules 5 and 6, and you can see how bridging across SKUs, bridging even to kind of published literature was useful in substantiating the APPH standard, which is what every applicant is trying to do in terms of securing an MGO. In module 6, the availability of historic commercial data coupled with a kind of prospective survey helps help do that. Not everyone can do that, which is why ARAC also conducts kind of randomized trials, the longitudinal cohort studies and the actual use studies that the FDA kind of expects applicants to utilize. In terms of the kind of developments of the FDA and the political change, obviously markets don't like change. I think there are people in this room, there's certainly other stakeholders who are kind of waiting for a kind of signal in the noise, maybe withholding a decision on a PMTA application. And I kind of want to say that I think there's actually more clarity about what the future of the PMTA process is going to look like and what's required than we've ever had before. So even 2 months ago we were kind of hearing questions about what the future of the CTP was, or the PMTA. Well, the censor is created by statute, so it's not going away because the Tobacco Control Act is not going away. It would require an act of legislation or congressional judicial review or a Supreme Court ruling. Well, we just saw with the Supreme Court ruling unanimous support for the way the FDA has interpreted the law. So that removes the kind of the quickest and surest route to judicial reform. In terms of the reduction in workforce, there are open questions about how that will enable the agency to return to that legislative mandate, which is to review applications in 180 days. And I hope they will be able to do that. If they are, they will encourage more applicants. And again, if they do that, but we'll talk about the illicit market. So
yeah, sure. No, thanks for that, Sam. I'd like to come to yeah. Go ahead, Bengt.
I have a small question to the audience. Could you raise your hand? How many have read the FDA sort of verdict, the approval of 20 sorts of sin? It's quite a few. Now I recommend everyone with an interest in the nicotine pouches to do read it, because it's like a guidebook on, well, they succeeded in the end. What's also interesting is FDA has shown clear interest in oral health and the use of nicotine pouches. So the question to the whole industry is, of course, are you prepared for the increasingly interest in oral health as well as growing media attention? Thank you.
Thank you for that, Ben. So just on that topic, and perhaps with Fredrik's help as well, if we can just talk about, should we say, the differences between regulatory frameworks with the US, where we know that bar is really high, and then Europe, where Tim has talked about TPD3 and sort of the potential for specific nicotine pouch regulation, which is obviously lacking from TPD2. But there are certain member states, such as Sweden, for example, who have enacted specific nicotine pouch regulation. Even in the UK, the Tobacco and Vapes Bill, while not specific with nicotine pouches, it does broaden definitions, and I do believe will bring in the nicotine pouch sector into that regulatory framework. So perhaps Fredrik and Bengt, comments on that?
Yeah, thank you. I think the Swedish regulation is very clear in the sense that it doesn't regulate pouches per se, it regulates tobacco-free nicotine products. So it's a very, very broad, all-encompassing legislation, and for a small company like ourselves, it's very good because it means both that it's very clear and it's plain, it's fair across different companies, but it also opens up, and I think that's the important point looking to other national regulations, it opens up for innovation. It doesn't specifically regulate a category that's already existing. And if I may take an example from ourselves, we applied for approval in Canada last year. Obviously now the regulation is proposed to change. And the way they have approached it in Health Canada is that they have specifically, explicitly listed a number of products. So they talk about transdermal patches, they talk about essentials, they talk about tablets, now they talk about pouches, they talk about dissolving products, and I think comparing those two approaches to legislation, I really prefer the Swedish one. All nicotine products, it doesn't matter if, what form they are, and most importantly, it opens up for new innovations, and I think that's very important going forward.
Yeah, go ahead, Bengt.
The Swedish regulations are really intelligent regulations, and they even cover tobacco-free nicotine products that has not yet been invented. My message to the rest of the European Union and the world is just copy-paste the Swedish regulations. We are world champions. We have the lowest smoking prevalence. We have the lowest cancer rates in all of Europe. It's not more difficult than that. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Bengt. I'd just like to come to Jonas now, just for his comment on the role that industry and organisations such as yourself can play in engagement with regulators so that we have appropriate science-based regulation which doesn't stifle innovation within the sector but provides the appropriate controls that are required with a nicotine product.
Yes, thank you. I mean, we are Brussels-based, I'm from Sweden as well, like Bengt and here. But I've been in Brussels for 20 years. Our mission is to inform and try to educate policymakers and politicians. 5 years ago, no one knew anything outside of Sweden. We're still having a huge gap in knowledge. We're facing this every day. I mean, we need politicians and policymakers that are willing to listen and can understand harm reduction and the value for a product like this. And of course, we need those that are so much against nicotine that there's no matter what we do, we will never reach out to them. Personally, I love the product. I think it's the best thing that's happened this market, this industry for years. But our effort will be of very little value if the full value chain isn't following or being responsible. I think it all comes down to this. If we have, from the producers to the source selling the product, if there's an unwillingness to take this responsibility, we will have a youth success, we will have very strong products, we will have marketing that can be perceived as attracting underage usage. And for me, meeting politicians, if I can't win those that are in favor of harm reduction because of the inability to self-regulate in the waiting for regulation, we have a huge problem. So for us, doing consultations, trying to influence the Commission, speaking with politicians, I wish that we'll get support from all of you that are part of this value chain and are willing to be responsible. So that's...
Yeah, thank you for that take on it, Jonas. I completely agree. Just again with the US market, perhaps, in terms of US regulatory engagement, Sam, Sarah, do you have any comments?
Yes, I mean, I think there's a tension between innovation and regulation, but there's also like a degree of complementarity. Like we need both. So we need to create space for innovations that help consumers transition to safer products, and we need regulations that communicate, disproportionate regulations that communicate through those differences the advantage, the availability, create the accessibility of safer products. And if you get the balance wrong, you can stifle innovation. If you set the barriers to entry too high, you create an illicit market, and that doesn't do all the things that you want a regulated product to do. So what does leadership look like in that space? I think it looks like engaging the regulator. I think it means being responsive to regulations. I think it means being compliant, communicative. I think it means putting the consumer at the center of decisions about what the product looks like from inception to post-market surveillance. But I also think innovation looks a bit like advocacy. When you do that, when you create the evidence base for the consumer-focused innovations, communicate that evidence to the regulator, explain this is why this feature of this product is needed. That looks like advocacy. Then you can have a conversation with the regulator about creating the conditions that favor health positive substitutions.
I think, just to add on to Sam's comment, I think it would be helpful to talk about what we mean when we say engagement with the regulator, which is a critical part of this process. And engagement with the regulator typically happens in pre-submission meetings before you submit a pre-market tobacco product application, for instance, and that would include a series of questions that we would submit to the agency. We would ask them to sit and meet with us ahead of that submission. And we would go through with them what we expect the science that we would conduct to look like. We would talk through the breadth of the data that we intended to collect and the robust procedures and policies under which we would collect that information, and ask for their opinion. And as part of that dialogue, we educate them on the products. And Sam mentioned the unique aspects of your product and what it can do to limit youth access and also to help those smokers switch. So that's one major opportunity for engagement through those pre-submission meetings with the agency. The other way is through post-market surveillance. There are not very many companies, aside from the large players in the space right now, who are dealing with post-market surveillance. We're fortunate enough to support some of those organizations, but that's a continued opportunity for education. And in a post-market setting, we're continuing to monitor specific products, but that's also an opportunity to educate FDA on the category. And what may be surprising to hear is that FDA needs that education. We work very closely with a lot of the scientists at the FDA. I live in the US, I live in Maryland, which is where the FDA is located. And the prevalence of smoking, particularly in that region, is very low. So a lot of the people that work at the FDA don't have as much exposure to smokers. Now that is not the case in the US more broadly, and so there is often the need for this dialogue and education because their perspective doesn't readily align with ours, and we have to bring them up to our level of understanding and our thinking around these products and how they fit into a regulated marketplace.
Yeah, I think they're really insightful comments, Sarah, thank you. And thank you for to the panel for the regulatory overview. As I say, we haven't got maybe enough time to go into this in detail with the US and Europe, but I think it's been a really interesting conversation. I'd like to move on to product safety and innovation. I know we have entrepreneurs and innovators on the panel today. And what our take would be on the best practices to ensure that we really have consumer trust with nicotine pouch products, the product labeling, the information provided to consumers, even to thinking about the potential for abuse, product abuse and liability as well. So I think I'd like to come to Fredrik and Bengt for that European perspective, and then perhaps Sam can make a comment as well.
So let me tell you a little bit more about myself. I'm Bengt Wiberg, the president and inventor and founder of Sting-Free Snus Tech. Nicotine pouches. We are the only pouch in the world with an integrated protection for the gum to reduce gum irritation, the burning sensation, and even some of the oral health problems. This story started in a dentist chair some 10 years plus, when my dentist told me I had to quit using snus because I had oral lesions, gum inflammation, and a beginning of receding gum. So this was the worst day of my life. But then I came up with this crazy idea. I put a Band-Aid on one side of the pouch, cut away the waste, and placed the protected side against my sore gums. Pain disappeared immediately. After a week, my gum inflammation was gone. I haven't had a snus lesion for 10 years, and my gums stopped receding. But for many years, I was patching up my pouches and started writing. I got tired of doing this. I wanted to buy this in a shop. So I contacted, I wrote a long email to Swedish Match, but then just before pressing send, I stopped myself. I said, Bengt, you can't be the only person in the world who has experienced these problems. So today, Sting-Free nicotine pouches are patented in the US, in every country in Europe, and we are selling, proving this concept, starting in Sweden. But I think an important message to all industry players is check out what does the consumers say. Did you know that 2/3 of the women and more than 50% of the men pouch users in Sweden are worried about their oral health? Some say that, oh, it's supposed to burn, you know, that's the greatest thing of all. Well, guess what? 18% of the men and 11% of the Swedish women love the burning sensation, but the majority does not. So we have done these surveys with more than close to 1,100 participants, asking them every aspect of pouch use. And from that data, we have gone to action. And here we are today. Innovation never stops.
It doesn't, Ben, you're absolutely right. Fredrik, I know you run an extremely innovative company. Would you have any comments on products and
Yeah, I think I want to pick up the consumer part that you mentioned, Bengt, because that's really important. I've been in the oral tobacco and nicotine industry for 17 years. I've seen the birth and growth of nicotine pouches. It really starts with the consumer. What is the consumer demand? What are the problems? And as in this industry, innovation is often driven by external factors. It's driven by taxation, it's driven by regulations, and it's the same thing here. Smoking restrictions are increasing, and there is a problem for consumers. How do I get my nicotine in those environments? And that's really the answer. And I think that's where, as innovative companies, we have a different product. It's not a pouch, it's a dissolving strip. But it's always about consumers. What do they want? What do they need? What are the problems we're trying to solve? And I think that with coming back to legislation, it's very important to have legislations that is open for new innovation, new ways of delivering nicotine to consumers in a safe way. So from my perspective, we're happy about the Swedish legislation, as I mentioned before. I think it's very important that legislators and the industry think openly about when we engage with stakeholders relating to regulation, that we don't focus only on the product that we have at hand, but we focus to make sure that legislation and regulations are open to innovation. I think that's very important.
Yeah, I totally agree. Fredrik, that is extremely important. I'd like to build on that with our discussion and talk about the tools available to industry for nicotine pouch products, sensory evaluation, human use factors, product liability, and even during the clinical studies. And I know Sam's business, ARAC, have a lot of experience. I think Sarah will be able to comment as well. So we'd certainly like to hear your thoughts on that area.
Yeah, so I think like what you're talking about is behavioural science-based consumer research, and it speaks to the importance of keeping the consumer at the heart of innovation. So this comes in before regulatory strategies. It comes in before going to market. I think sometimes some of these studies are, almost an afterthought, but they have to be primary. The risk is that if you don't keep the consumer at the center, if you assume you know what the consumer wants, if you're in an environment like the US where you're spending money to just get a PMTA, you're going to produce something that is speaking to a gap that's not there, or doesn't speak to a gap that is. So one way to do that is just to take a consumer pulse. So take a prototype, go to the market segment, get some quick feedback to make sure that the need that you're addressing is there, or that you are addressing the need that needs to be met. Competitive assessment goes a step further. How does your product compare against something else that exists? How does your consumer rate the taste duration, nicotine hit, nicotine intensity, throat hit? But so these are just some of the approaches that can be applied here.
I think Sam's bringing forward really important aspects of the product development process and the iteration that you go through to refine a product before you take it through the regulatory pathway. And I think that the consumer studies, as Sam pointed out, are a very important part of that work. In terms of the approach, what we see happen regularly with our clients, and we're a regulatory and scientific consulting firm. We support companies that are going through this, and we encourage our clients to bring us in as early in the process as possible. If they're even considering bringing a product to the US market, we want them to speak with us, because through the product lock, the product design lock, as you're developing the product you want to bring to market, everyone understands that the consumers need to want the product. That's the price to pay, the base barrier to entry. But particularly with the US market and in some European markets as well, it's also incredibly important to select a product design that has regulatory viability, something that the regulator has the capacity to authorize. And so we can't just please the consumer, we can't just please the regulator. We have to thread that needle, and that's one of the things that our group does, I think, particularly well with our clients, is helping them find a product that can actually make it through this very rigorous pathway for regulation, but also fill a need in the market.
Yeah, absolutely, Sarah. Sorry, Fredrik.
Can I just add something? Going back to consumer need and the balance between consumers and regulators. I think what is very important with nicotine pouches specifically, and we will talk more about that potentially on the regulation when it comes to nicotine levels. There are some regulations already in place now with maximum nicotine contents, and I think that's very, very good, because the consumers' needs are nicotine, primarily nicotine delivery. And nicotine delivery is never, in the 15 milligrams or 30 milligrams or even higher than that. So it's very important to take responsibility as a producer and distributor when it comes to bringing products that are both safe, obviously, but also fulfills the needs. In terms of, we're in the nicotine industry. We're here to deliver nicotine to consumers in a safe way, and we don't need to over-deliver. And I think we see a lot of those products, and that's hurting all of us, because it gives the regulators not only an opportunity to put in maximum levels, but also to ban it. And I think we need to be responsible, we need to bring safe products and reasonably strong products to market if we want to avoid potential bans.
Yeah, I think again that's very insightful, Fredrik. Jonas, from your perspective, with your organisation, I believe you have some comments.
No, well, of course, it's really good to hear what Fredrik is saying, and that's what we're trying to say. And we already see a lot of member states regulating it. We still have unregulated markets. I can somehow understand people working with marketing on an unregulated market with a new product. There's lots of temptation to go a bit too far, but it's so short-sighted, because it will be regulated. It probably starts at member states, and then I believe that we'll see it regulated on a new level as well. And if you only have bad examples and bad products in the market, you will get a regulation based on fear and not the potential benefits of this product. So I'm very happy. We're really looking for this part of the value chain to get on support.
We need regulatory frameworks based on evidence-based approach, not driven by fear.
Exactly. And if I may add, most of us know why snus is banned in the EU. It's not only about strength, so I wanted to add marketing practices as well and communication practices. The reason why snus is banned in the EU was because in the 80s there were too aggressive marketing, especially in the UK and Ireland, and that's the other part where we need to take responsibility as producers and distributors. So both the product itself, it's reasonable, it's safe, it's delivering what it's supposed to deliver, but also in terms of marketing practices and how we approach and go to market.
Yeah, absolutely, Fredrik. It's interesting, in preparation for this panel discussion, I had a look at the latest draft of the tobacco and vapes bill in the UK. I think it's in the House of Lords at the moment for the second reading. And anyway, just on snus, I just noticed a part in the bill that basically talks about snus possession with intent to supply. I was just like, okay, yeah, it's got to that, hasn't it? So yeah, absolutely right. So the education, the engagement, as I say, with regulators, with snus, you know, there is the epidemiology data. So Sweden, which has proven the harm reduction case, and I think it's part of industry to just keep going with that message and keep the engagement of the harm reduction potential of these products and safer nicotine delivery. So I'd like to move our discussion on to, we've heard about regulation, product safety and information, really keeping the consumer in mind and using those, using the engagement with regulators on the benefits of nicotine pouch products. Now, I think again, similar to before, what really are the lessons from the vaping industry that we can learn for the nicotine pouch industry, and in terms of missteps that have been taken in Europe, but certainly in the US as well, and the burning issue of youth access prevention. So I'd just like to hear the panel's thoughts on that area. So perhaps from a US perspective, again, Sarah and Sam can fight out for which one goes first, and then we'll hear from our European experts.
I think one of the major lessons learned from what happened in the US with ENDS products was the need for education to influence consumer understanding, but also general public understanding, even people who may not be using the product, potentially parents, and even the regulator. The narrative around these products is so incredibly important, and so a lot of that, in terms of the ability for industry to influence, that comes through in your marketing, which you pointed out is incredibly important. The messaging that you're using that influences who the product is for and how people perceive who the product is for, that part is incredibly important. In the US in particular, the industry is limited in terms of their ability to educate, very limited. So industry has to rely on other stakeholders that have the ability to educate. Historically, the FDA has not been very good at education. There have been studies done on physicians in the US and their perceptions around nicotine, and if I have the number right, I think it's about 70% of physicians in the US believe that nicotine causes cancer. Nicotine is addictive, but in terms of cancer causing, it's very benign. There are cardiovascular effects. But this is a gap, I think, particularly in the US around what physicians understand, and if physicians don't understand it, imagine what the general consumer understands. So it's incredibly important, I think, for us as an industry to use our relationships with other key stakeholders, take the opportunities that we have to educate the regulator, but also to find ways to work with public health interest groups, which in this space I recognize is difficult, but it's an incredibly important part of the equation.
Okay, Bengt.
I'm very happy Sam brought up the fact that the majority of the populations, both in the US and many other countries, still believe nicotine is what's causing cancer. The information is readily available. If anyone in the world can Google the question, does nicotine in itself cause cancer? And you will have the reply from the World Health Organization, from FDA Tobacco, from Cancer Organization, and the answer is no, nicotine in itself does not cause cancer. And I'd like to reconnect with Tim Phillips of the Tobacco Intelligence, because for the past years they have done a survey among EU Parliament politicians, members of Parliament, and if I remember correctly, I think the figure was slightly over 40% of our EU politicians still believe it's the nicotine which is the harmful thing, no difference between combustible cigarettes, snus or nicotine pouches or vapes. So this is, for me, the helicopter view is to make this very, very important information more available. And here, I think FDA, EU, universities could do a lot more to explain the differences. It's the way you consume nicotine, which could be bad or much less harmful. Thank you.
Yeah, so going back to the question about how we can learn from vape and previous actions, I think again it's a matter of consistency in communication. So you cannot, as an industry player, engage with regulators and focus only on harm reduction, and then engage with consumers in a very aggressive or completely different way in terms of lifestyle, in terms of attraction, showing young people. So it's very important to be consistent, I think, and we try to be that as well. So we don't paint a picture that is not consistent between these two stakeholders. So I think that's very important to do that. And going back to your question about experiences, I don't think that has been done in a good way.
Yeah, I completely agree, Fredrik.
Yeah, so just to add another kind of dimension to that, so my colleagues at ARAC have been conducting TPPI, tobacco perception, product perception, and intention studies since 2015. Our CRO spoke to the Centre for Tobacco Products at that time, highlighting the risk of misunderstandings about nicotine and the relative risk of different products. This is probably the fundamental challenge that our industry faces in terms of consumers who might use these products and don't because they think that they are more dangerous than the product that kills every second long-term user. The solution is going to be really complicated because there is feedback between health communication, marketing, product availability, consumer perceptions of those products, and the way that the consumer builds those off of the messages that regulation communicates. In the US, we've got new tax on safer products coming in all the time. Well, that in an environment where the tax on combustibles isn't increasing, that's just signals that this is the more dangerous product. So of course, 70% of the population doesn't get it right. Yeah, we have to think in terms of the system and not silo.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right, Sam. Again, we've learned from the vaping industry the public perception in terms of the relative harm of vaping products compared to combustible cigarettes. I mean, certainly in my country, the UK, that perception is going in completely the wrong direction. Some of the latest surveys released by ASH indicate that, I don't know the exact figures, but for example, over half of people questioned believe that vapes were as harmful or even more harmful than combustible cigarettes. And certainly we need to learn from that experience and really provide the information as an industry to consumers to make informed choices about the relative risk of nicotine products and that, the continuum of risk that we're all familiar with. And then, as adult tobacco nicotine users can make informed choices. So I think that's certainly really important. I'm just keeping an eye on time, and we do have a little bit more time to move on to the third topic that I noted down. Sorry, Jonas, go ahead.
No, only very quickly. We can learn a lot from the vape industry, but going around at fairs like this for 5 years, my experience is that we are seeing a good development. The products I tested as a consumer 5 years ago is not the same as yours today. The quality is getting higher. And I think the main difference between vape and pouches is the complexity of making a good pouch. Good products will drive out bad products on the market. And this is particularly true when you start to regulate. When quality products are established in the markets, consumer will switch. I mean, most lately in Iceland, where they legislated on this topic, they used to have very strong pouches of less good quality. After regulation, we can see that the strong ones are almost out to market, and we have those products that we think is better for the market.
Yeah, that's very insightful, Jonas, thank you. Just while we do have a little bit more time left, I'd like to gain the panel's insights on potentially some of the economic impacts of the regulatory pathways that we've discussed, specifically with the US and also with Europe. I mean, in the US, we know that barrier to market entry is high. Bert and I had a discussion earlier regarding for ZIN, for example, is it potentially fully necessary for even though it's on a product by product basis, is it fully necessary for a complete rerun for the next product or a slight iteration of ZIN? So I'd certainly like to hear from the panel on what's our take on those high barriers to market entry for innovative, non-global businesses, and what impact does that have on key stakeholders and consumers and their access to, say, less harmful forms of nicotine consumption?
I can start. I think we have seen the position shift for companies that want to enter the US market. It used to be possible to start in the US. I don't think that is very common anymore. Our group has shifted to start working with companies much earlier in the process, and a lot of our clients are actually beginning their journey to the US and other markets. And the barrier to entry in the US is incredibly high. It's a multi-million-dollar regulatory pathway. And one of the things we are doing as a company is trying to find ways to make that more accessible. We offer cost-sharing options for clients on components of the application that are not product-specific, so that more of the client's budget can go to those product-specific studies, so that we can try to reduce the overall burden without limiting your chance of success of achieving a marketing granted order, because I think that's what makes the US so incredibly difficult right now, is if you don't achieve a marketing granted order, all of those funds have not gotten you anywhere. So it's incredibly important to understand that the approach has to be sound. There are no shortcuts here in terms of a cheap and easy way to get into the US market. That certainly exists through the illicit pathway, but that's not a long-term strategy. So if your business wants a long-term presence in the US, we have to find ways to make the regulatory pathway, the PMTA pathway, more accessible, and that's one of the focuses of our business.
Yeah, I'd just like to pick up on that. So Sarah's mentioned the illicit products, and I think some of the discussions which have taken place over the last couple of days, with the US, the percentage of illicit vapes which are currently consumed on the market, and we know that illicit nicotine pouch products certainly are on the increase in both of the markets that we're discussing, the US and also the EU. So I'm not sure if the panel has any comments on how those regulatory frameworks can be tuned, and sort of what other industry-led or consumer organisation-led discussion which can take place to basically have consumer confidence in the products and sort of the potential risks of illicit products being supplied to consumers.
Going back to your first question, I think the biggest economic impact of the regulatory situation in the EU is that it's not one, it's not aligned. So, and it's changing as we saw on the graph before. So, for us as a company, for example, yeah, we have to by country assess the regulatory situation. What would the impacts be of this? And that's very costly and difficult, and as a small company you don't have the knowledge or the resources to do that. And then, so I think the innovation is held back by the fact that there is not one homogeneous regulation in the EU so far. At least that's true for us.
So it's a really important question. I think whether your goal is youth access prevention, public safety, tax revenue generation, whatever it is, the illicit market is not going to be the way to achieve that. So how do we regain market share from the illicit space? I think there are carrots and sticks. I think a lot of the political rhetoric at the moment is around enforcement, and certainly is a part of that. But the literature on criminology is actually really clear that when you increase enforcement in an illicit space, there's almost a perverse response to that, which the people who are able to evade detection and prosecution have more of an incentive to keep doing what they're doing because they've got more market share. So that has to be coupled with reducing the barriers to entry for the regulated space. We need that 180-day review period, the clarity that I think we now have about what the PMTA requires, creating space and innovation, all the things we've been talking about today. That is as much, if not a more important piece of commercial success, market success, and a public health than enforcement.
Yeah, absolutely. So, Jonas, do you have any comments on illicit nicotine pouches from the perspective of your organisation?
Yes, we haven't experienced a lot of problems so far. If you don't look at countries like Finland, that intended to ban it and realized that we need to regulate it instead. And they could see a huge difference in tax revenues. And Europe is evolving, as Tim excellently pointed out. You can see member states starting to implement regulations. And as I said before, I'm convinced that we'll have a regulation that making the quite low barrier today a bit higher. And then it's up to us, it's up to the industry, it's up to the value chain to make sure that it doesn't get too high, that we all act responsibly and keep it at a good level.
Yeah, absolutely, Jonas, I completely agree. Bengt, do you have a comment?
Yes, I think the best way to fight illicit trade is to get some kind of basic regulations in place, because as long as there is no regulation, you will see these absurd products with 150 milligrams that I wouldn't dare to drive my car if I placed one of those under my lip. And going back to Tim Phillips of Tobacco Intelligence, the question, will pouches be banned in the EU? I'm very, very proud of the Swedish government, now gone public, that over their dead bodies, so to say, there will be no bans or super high taxes on nicotine pouches. And to prove that, Sweden has gone from being a mouse to a lion. So Sweden has now opposed the proposed bans in Spain and in France, delaying this for at least 3 months. This is the minimum time in order to discuss the science and the reason. I would say the major reason why Sweden has, among Swedish born, we are down now to 4.5% daily smokers, with the absolute lowest cancer rates. So there's hope out there.
Yeah, it's we hope, Bengt. So I'm just keeping an eye on time. When I discussed the potential topics with my fellow panelists via email a couple of weeks back, there was some doubt we would get through all of these areas, but we have just about managed to get it. I think we scratched the surface. It's such an exciting area, the nicotine pouch space with innovation. Again, some of our panelists here are at the forefront of that innovation. But there are challenges, whether they be regulatory, whether they be product safety and standards, and as we touched upon now, illicit pouch products, and the potential dangers of irresponsible pouch products as well. Because I've seen that 150 mg pouch product as well, and I was just, it's a potential fatality. And that type of incident, we all remember the effect the Avali scare in the US, again, with the information that was put out, had on not just the US vape sector, but also it spread to Europe as well. I was still involved in the e-cigarette industry back then, and it really impacted the business I worked for as well. So there's definitely lessons to be learned from that area. So just as we're coming up on time, I'd like to invite each panelist just to provide some closing remarks briefly, just to summarise their thoughts on our discussion this afternoon.
I'll keep it very brief. The process, the regulatory framework is incredibly complex, as we pointed out on this panel. It's complex regardless of which of the markets we've discussed today you'll be working in. I think it's incredibly important to consider the impact of those regulatory frameworks very early on in your pursuit of bringing a product to market. And they will continue to change. The regulatory frameworks will continue to shift, and we will continue to adapt. So I think it's just critically important to make that a part of your overall strategy.
Yeah, my message would be we want homogeneous EU legislation soon, and we don't want it on nicotine pouches explicitly, we want it on nicotine products. Tobacco-free consumer products with nicotine. Open for innovation, plain and fair field for all to operate and innovate. So we should act as producers and industry players. We should act responsibly. We should act consistently in our communication to regulatory bodies and our consumers, and take responsibility and say that we want regulation, we want taxation, we want a clear playing field so that we can operate and innovate in the future.
So regulators think in terms of risks and benefits. Industry needs to innovate to both mitigate risks and leverage benefits. Researchers like ARAC can support both substantiating the evidence behind innovations. And then we need regulators to create the conditions under where competing on responsibility is a winning value proposition.
Yes, I can only second what Fredrik is saying. Again, we believe in EU legislation. We're also happy to see that member states are regulating this. This makes it a completely different ball game compared to snus back in the days. I do not believe that we will face a ban. We will most likely face some infringements depending on the products we've seen. It has caused some problems. But I will do our utmost to contribute to legislation that is working for everyone. My final message, please catch up. I will be here today. I will be very happy to share our position, what we believe our responsible supply chain need to pick up on. Yes, thank you, everyone.
I think I have talked enough already, but very, very shortly, I agree with Jonas on regulation is something good. And I think the industry, the serious players in the industry have already shown this, because the Swedish regulation on tobacco-free nicotine products, even those not invented yet, came in 2022. But nicotine pouches has been sold since 2017, I think. The industry immediately agreed on placing an 18-year-old limit to these products. And looking today at the Swedish regulations, it is forbidden to market, to target an audience under 25 years old, or using persons who might look to be under 25 years old. And every manufacturer has accepted these, because like somebody said, like you said, let's create a playing field which is the same for everybody. Thank you very much.
Yeah, absolutely, Bengt. We certainly second those comments. So we'll say we're right on time. It's been a pleasure to moderate this panel of experts, certainly from a US and European perspective. I've certainly learned a lot for your comments, so I thank you again. And yeah, I just again like to thank Elise for the opportunity to have this discussion in front of this audience. Thank you very much, everyone.